David's cologne lingered in the air long after he'd left our apartment, our home, for the last time. I sat motionless on the edge of our bed, his side already stripped bare, staring at the half-empty closet where designer suits worth more than my monthly salary had hung just hours ago. The message on my phone glowed with cruel finality. I deserve someone on my level. She understands my world in ways you never could. 15 years together. Gone in a text message. I picked up the framed photo from our nightstand, David in his tailored Armani at last year's charity gala, his arm around my waist, my navy department store dress suddenly looking shabby through my tears. The woman who'd replaced me had been in that photo too, standing just out of frame, her red Valentino gown and family connections making her impossible to ignore. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you, Sophia Winters, old money, impeccable connections, everything I wasn't. You'll never belong in his world, my mother had warned when David and I first met in college. Back then, he was just a brilliant economics student with ambition burning in his eyes, and I was the scholarship girl who tutored him through calculus. We were equals then. At least, that's what I'd believed. The buzzing of my phone interrupted my spiral. It wasn't David. Of course it wasn't. Eleanor? Are you okay? I just heard. Maggie's voice carried the weight of genuine concern. My oldest, friend since freshman year. The only person who'd warned me about the lingering glances between David and Sophia at office functions. He's gone, Mags. My voice sounded hollow, even to my own ears. Packed his things this morning while I was at work. Left his keys in a text message. That absolute bastard. The venom in her voice almost made me smile. Almost. Where are you? I'm coming over. An hour later, Maggie sat across from me at the kitchen island, pouring generous glasses of the expensive wine David had been saving for a special occasion. Her dark curls were still damp from the rain outside, her makeup-free face fierce with loyalty. 15 years, I whispered, staring into the deep red liquid. And he couldn't even end it face to face. Because he's a coward, Maggie said flatly, reaching across to grasp my hand. A pathetic social climbing coward who's about to discover exactly what he's lost. I laughed bitterly. What he's lost? Maggie, he's traded up. Everyone knows it. The accounts manager marrying the investment bank's VP was cute when we were both climbing. But now? I gestured around at my modestly furnished apartment. David's a managing partner at Blackridge Capital, and Sophia is the daughter of its founder. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. So that's it? You're just going to let him walk away after 15 years? After everything you've done for him? Maggie's eyes narrowed. Who proofread every one of his presentations when he was too nervous to trust himself? Who networked with the partners' wives when he was too awkward to make small talk? Who postponed her own career advancement to relocate 3 times for his promotions? I stared into my untouched wine. Each word hit like a precision strike. But I couldn't muster the energy to feel angry. The hollowness was too consuming. It doesn't matter anymore, I finally said. David made his choice. Maggie slammed her glass down with surprising force. Bullshit. You know what matters? That presentation he's giving to the board next week, the one you stayed up until 3 a.m. helping him rehearse? The Henderson merger that you basically outlined? The strategy for? The fact that half of Blackridge thinks he's a genius because you've been his uncredited ghostwriter for a decade? I flinched. The Henderson merger. David's crowning achievement. The deal that had finally put him in the same room as Sophia Winters on a regular basis. The irony wasn't lost on me. What's your point, Maggie? That I helped build my own replacement? My point is that David Ellis isn't half the financial wizard everyone thinks he is. And maybe it's time they all learned that. The coldness in her, voice finally cut through my numbness. Maggie had never liked David, had always seen through his carefully cultivated charm. But this was something else. "What exactly are you suggesting?" I asked cautiously. Maggie's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "I'm suggesting that while David may have left you for someone better, you have the power to make sure he regrets that decision for the rest of his life." I should have shut down the conversation there. Should have thanked her for the wine and the sympathy and sent her home. That's what the old Eleanor would have done. The supportive wife, the team player, the woman who'd spent 15 years helping a man achieve his dreams while quietly shelving her own. Instead, I took my first sip of David's prized Bordeaux and said, "I'm listening." Maggie leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "First, we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. What do you know about Sophia Winters beyond the obvious?" I shrugged. "Harvard Business School, family money, her father founded Blackridge. She's been fast-tracked since joining 3 years ago. Everyone treats her like she walks on water." The bitterness in my voice surprised even me. That's the public profile. But people like that always have secrets. Maggie pulled out her phone. "My cousin Marcus works in financial journalism. He's been tracking the Winters family for years. There are rumors that not all of their fortune was built through strictly legal channels." I frowned. Even if that's true, what does it have to do with me? Maybe nothing, maybe everything. Maggie's fingers flew across her screen. "The point is, knowledge is power, and right now you need every advantage you can get." Something cold and unfamiliar unfurled in my chest, a sensation I'd never allowed myself to feel before. 15 years of supporting, accommodating, understanding. 15 years of shrinking myself to fit into David's world. And for what? "I need to know everything," I said quietly. "About both of them." Maggie's smile widened. "Now you're thinking clearly. But first things first, you need to secure yourself, financially. Joint accounts, credit cards, investments." "What's the situation?" The question snapped me back to practical reality. "We have a joint checking account for household expenses, but most of our savings are in separate accounts. I'm still on our shared credit card, the one with the travel points." I paused, thinking. His name is on the apartment lease, but I've made every payment for the past 3 years. Digital files? Cloud accounts? Email? I blinked. "We share a cloud drive for household documents, and I know all his passwords. I set them up." A small, humorless laugh escaped me. "He could never remember them." Good. That's very good. Maggie reached for her purse, pulling out a sleek laptop. "Let's start there. Every email, every document, every financial record. If it's in a shared digital space, we need to archive it now before he remembers to change the passwords. Is that legal?" I hesitated, my ingrained rule-following instincts flaring up. "Completely. These are accounts you legitimately have access to, containing information relevant to your relationship and joint finances." Her eyes met mine. "But we should move quickly. Men like David have a way of rewriting history once they've decided to move on." 3 hours and 2 bottles of wine later, we had systematically downloaded 5 years of emails, financial statements, text messages, and calendar entries from every account I had legitimate access to. The meticulous organization that had made me an excellent accounts manager served me well as I cataloged everything into clearly labeled folders. "I still don't see how any of this helps me," I said, rubbing my tired eyes. "So, I have proof he's been planning to leave me for months." "So what?" Maggie was scrolling through a series of email exchanges between David and the Henderson Group's CFO. "Eleanor," she said slowly, "have you actually read these merger documents? The ones David's been working on? Not closely. He just needed me to help with the presentation format and rehearse his talking points." I moved to look over her shoulder. "Why?" Because I'm no financial expert, but even I can see that something about these projections doesn't add up. She pointed to a spreadsheet attachment. Look at these growth forecasts. They're impossibly optimistic. I frowned, scanning the numbers with my accountant's precision. Maggie was right. The projected returns were wildly inflated beyond any reasonable market expectation. That can't be right, I murmured, diving deeper into the attached files. The board would never approve these projections if they saw the underlying data. Unless they never see the underlying data, Maggie said grimly. Is it possible David's doctoring the numbers to make this merger look better than it is? He wouldn't. I started automatically, then stopped myself. The David I thought I knew wouldn't have ended our 15-year relationship with a text message either. Let me see the original financial models. As the night deepened around us, I lost myself in what I did best. Numbers. And what I found made my blood run cold. Layer upon layer of manipulated projections, hidden fees, and misleading analyses. The Henderson merger wasn't the golden opportunity David was presenting to the board. It was a financial time bomb. He's gambling with the entire firm's reputation, I whispered, horrified. If these projections fail, and they will, Blackridge could face lawsuits, regulatory investigations, maybe even criminal charges. And who signed off on all this creative accounting? Maggie asked pointedly. The answer hit me like a physical blow as I checked the document properties. Sophia Winters. Her digital signature is on every draft. Well, Maggie leaned back, a strange light in her eyes. It seems your replacement might not be the financial genius everyone thinks she is either. Or she knows exactly what she's doing, I countered, a new thought forming. What if the Henderson merger isn't what it appears to be? What if there's another agenda entirely? Maggie raised an eyebrow. What are you thinking? I need to make some calls, I said, reaching for my phone. There's someone who might be able to help us understand what's really happening here. At 2 a.m.? Maggie asked skeptically. No, but first thing tomorrow. I stood up, a strange calm settling over me. Marcus isn't the only one with contacts in financial journalism. Remember Eric Donovan from the Economic Crimes Unit? We dated briefly before I met David. The FBI guy? Eleanor, what exactly are you planning? I looked around the apartment that suddenly felt like a monument to my own naive devotion. 15 years of supporting a man who couldn't even face me when he left. 15 years of being the perfect partner, only to be discarded when someone more convenient, more connected came along. I'm not planning anything yet, I said carefully. But David and Sophia have made a critical error in judgment. What's that? Maggie asked. I smiled for the first time that day, a small, cold expression that felt foreign on my face. They think I'm irrelevant. Just the discarded wife who'll quietly disappear while they build their perfect power couple narrative. I picked up the wedding photo, David's confident smile now looking smug and calculating. But they've forgotten something important. What's that? I'm the one who knows where all the bodies are buried. I set the photo face down on the counter, turning my back on 15 years of memories. And I think it's time to start digging. The next morning dawned with merciless brightness, sunlight streaming through curtains I'd forgotten to close. My head throbbed from the wine and revelations of the previous night, but underlying the physical discomfort was something new, a clarity and purpose I hadn't felt in years. My phone buzzed with a text from Maggie. Coffee and strategy session. At 10, bringing reinforcements. Before I could reply, another notification appeared, an email from Blackridge Capital's HR department. The subject line was brutally concise. Employment status change request. David was having me removed from his health insurance and company benefits. Less than 24 hours after walking out, something cold and hard crystallized in my chest as I stared at the screen. Whatever lingering doubts I might have had about Maggie's suggested course of action evaporated in that moment. I typed a quick response to her text. My place, 10 a.m. Bring everything you've got. Then I opened my laptop and began methodically downloading every remaining document from our shared cloud storage. The time for hesitation was over. David had declared war with a text message and an HR email, and I was finally ready to fight back. Precisely at 10 a.m., 3 sharp knocks echoed through my apartment. Maggie wasn't alone. Behind her stood a tall man with salt and pepper hair and calculating eyes that missed nothing as they swept over my living room. Eleanor, this is Marcus Chen, Maggie said, closing the door behind them. My cousin from the Financial Times. Marcus nodded, extending his hand. I've been following the Winters family for years. When Maggie told me what happened, I knew I had to help. I gestured toward the dining table, now covered with printouts of financial documents I'd spent the morning analyzing. I appreciate it, but I'm still not sure what we're doing here. Even if the Henderson merger projections are manipulated, what does that have to do with me? Marcus set his leather briefcase on the table. Everything, potentially. May I? He gestured to the documents. I nodded, watching as he methodically scanned through the spreadsheets, his expression growing increasingly interested. These projections aren't just optimistic, he finally said. They're deliberately misleading. The question is why? Who benefits if this merger goes through despite being built on false projections? Sophia and David get the credit for bringing in a major deal, I offered. Yes, but there's more. Marcus pulled out his laptop. The Winters family has been divesting from certain sectors very strategically over the past year. And one of those sectors is commercial real estate, particularly properties that would be directly affected by this merger. My accountant's brain clicked the pieces together. They're selling before the merger fails and property values tank. Exactly. Marcus's eyes gleamed with the intensity of a journalist onto something big. Classic pump and dump. Use inflated projections to drive up values, sell your holdings before reality catches up, then watch from a safe distance as everyone else takes the hit. But that's securities fraud, Maggie finished, setting 3 mugs of coffee on the table. And your husband and his new girlfriend are right in the middle of it. Marcus raised an eyebrow. To be fair, we don't have definitive proof that your husband knows he's part of a fraud scheme. He might just be the useful idiot. The words stung, but I couldn't dismiss them. The David I knew was ambitious and sometimes morally flexible, but outright fraud. Then again, the David I thought I knew wouldn't abandon 15 years with a text message. Either way, I said slowly, if the Henderson merger goes through based on these projections, a lot of innocent people will lose their investments when it ultimately fails. And the Winters family walks away richer than ever, Marcus added. Maggie crossed her arms. So what do we do? Go to the SEC? Marcus winced. Complicated. The SEC moves slowly, and by the time they investigate, the damage will be done. Plus, as the estranged wife, Eleanor's motives would be questioned. So we do nothing? I asked, frustration building. I didn't say that. Marcus leaned forward. What if there was a way to stop the merger and expose the Winters family without putting you in the line of fire? My phone buzzed with an incoming text. David. Need Henderson presentation files by EOD. Password changed on Cloud Drive. Email them to work address. No greeting. No acknowledgement of our shattered relationship. Just a demand for the files I'd helped create. I showed the message to Maggie and Marcus. The audacity, Maggie seethed, but Marcus was thoughtful. This could be our opening. You still have access to these presentation files? Of course. I practically built them. I pulled up the sleek slide deck on my laptop. David may be the face of the merger, but I'm the one who organized all the data and created the visuals. And if those visuals were to show the actual projections, instead of the manipulated ones... Marcus let the thought hang. I stared at him. You want me to sabotage the presentation? Not sabotage, Marcus corrected. Correct. Replace the false data with accurate projections based on the underlying numbers. Let the board see the truth about what they're being asked to approve. Maggie's eyes widened. Eleanor, this is perfect. David would be humiliated in front of the entire board, but I was already shaking my head. They'd know immediately it was me. I'd be legally liable. Not if we're careful, Marcus countered. The modifications would simply restore accurate data that's already in Blackridge's systems, just hidden under layers of manipulation. I thought about it. I could embed the original source data links in the presentation instead of the doctored spreadsheets. When David clicks to show the projections, he'll be presenting the real numbers without even realizing it, Maggie finished, a slow smile spreading across her face. It's elegant, Marcus admitted. But there's another angle here that might be even more powerful. We both looked at him expectantly. I have a source at the SEC who's already been looking into some of the Winters family's more questionable transactions. What if, instead of just embarrassing David at the board meeting, we feed this information to the right investigators? That would take longer, Maggie pointed out. Yes, but the impact would be far greater. Marcus turned to me. The choice is yours, Eleanor. Quick revenge or long-term justice? I stared at the text from David. The man who'd shared my bed for 15 years couldn't even bother with basic courtesy now that I'd served my purpose. Why choose? I said finally. Let's do both. 2 hours later, Marcus left with copies of all the relevant documents, heading straight to his SEC contact. Maggie and I sat at my dining table, methodically working through the Henderson presentation. You realize, Maggie said as she helped me embed the accurate data sources, that this won't just embarrass David. It might end his career at Blackridge. I know. My fingers paused over the keyboard. Am I a terrible person for doing this? Maggie gave me a level look. Is David a terrible person for throwing away 15 years with a text message? Is Sophia terrible for helping orchestrate a fraud that will cost innocent investors millions? You're not the villain in this story. Eleanor. My phone buzzed again. Another text from David. Still waiting on those files. Need them ASAP. I took a deep breath and hit send on the email I'd prepared. The modified presentation was now in David's hands. In 3 days, he would stand before the Blackridge board and unknowingly present the truth about the Henderson merger. What now? Maggie asked. Now, I said, closing my laptop. We prepare for phase 2. The next morning, I walked into Blackridge Capital's gleaming headquarters for the first time in months. As an accounts manager at a different firm, I rarely had reason to visit David's workplace. Today, however, I had manufactured one. Eleanor Ellis to see Gloria Harrington, HR Director. I told the receptionist, keeping my voice steady. I have an appointment regarding benefit transitions. The receptionist's expression flickered with recognition and pity. News of David's sudden departure from our marriage had clearly made the rounds. Of course, Mrs. Ellis. 15th floor. She's expecting you? I nodded my thanks, ignoring the curious glances that followed me to the elevator. The irony wasn't lost. On me. I'd been to countless Blackridge social events as David's wife, yet this was only my second time visiting the actual offices. David had always preferred to keep our professional lives separate. Now I understood why. Gloria Harrington's office was a model of corporate efficiency. The HR director herself was a trim woman in her 50s, with shrewd eyes that assessed me carefully as I entered. Mrs. Ellis, please have a seat. Ms. Walker, actually, I corrected gently. I never changed my name professionally. A flicker of approval crossed Gloria's face. Of course. My apologies, Ms. Walker. I understand you're here to discuss the transition of benefits following your separation? Yes. I placed my leather portfolio on her desk. I received notification that I'm being removed from David's health insurance. I wanted to ensure everything is handled correctly. Quite prudent, Gloria nodded, typing something into her computer. "We've received Mr. Ellis's request, but these transitions typically take 30 days to process. You should remain covered until the end of the month." "I appreciate that." I paused, then added carefully, "There's also the matter of the Blackridge Family Foundation pledge." Gloria frowned. "I'm not sure I follow." "The charitable pledge David and I made last quarter." I pulled out a document from my portfolio. "We committed to a 5-year donation schedule to the Foundation's education initiative. Given the circumstances, I wanted to clarify how that will be handled." Gloria took the document, genuine confusion crossing her face. "I don't recall Mr. Ellis mentioning any personal pledge to the Foundation." "Oh?" I feigned surprise. "That's odd. We discussed it extensively. The paperwork was finalized in February." I pulled out another document, the check with both our signatures and the accompanying pledge form. "Perhaps it hasn't been processed yet." Gloria studied the documents, her frown deepening. "This appears to be in order, but it's strange that it's not in our system. The Foundation is Chairman Winter's personal project." "I understand. Perhaps there was some miscommunication." I smiled apologetically. "I'd hate for there to be any confusion, especially with the Foundation's annual gala next week. David mentioned Chairman Winters specifically thanked him for our commitment." Gloria's eyes narrowed slightly. "Did he now?" "I'm sure it's just an administrative oversight," I added smoothly. "Would you mind looking into it? I'd like to ensure our pledge is properly recognized, regardless of our personal situation." "Of course," Gloria said, her tone shifting from sympathetic to intrigued. "I'll speak with the Foundation director immediately." "Thank you." I stood, extending my hand. "I appreciate your discretion in this matter." As I left Gloria's office, I checked my watch. The carefully placed seeds of doubt would need time to germinate. According to the building directory, I had 15 minutes before my next appointment, just enough time for a casual detour. The executive floor was eerily quiet as I stepped off the elevator. Most of the senior staff would be in the daily strategy meeting, including David. The administrative assistant's desk outside his office was momentarily unattended, giving me the perfect opportunity. I walked purposefully toward David's office, projecting the confidence of someone who belonged there. The door was unlocked. David had always been careless about security, relying on the assistants to monitor access. His office was exactly as I'd imagined from his descriptions over the years. Corner views of the city, modernist furniture, shelves lined with financial texts and industry awards. What hadn't appeared in his descriptions were the framed photos of Sophia now prominently displayed on his desk, already replacing 15 years of our shared history. I took a deep breath, focusing on why I was here. It took less than 2 minutes to place the small USB drive in the underside drawer of his desk, hidden but accessible. On it was a program that would activate during his board presentation, ensuring that even if he noticed and tried to correct the accurate projections I'd embedded, the true data would continue to override his attempts. Just as I was preparing to leave, voices approached in the hallway. I recognized one immediately, Sophia Winters, her crisp British accent unmistakable. "The board is getting impatient, David. We need to accelerate the timeline." "Everything's on track for Friday's presentation," David's voice replied, tense in a way I recognized from countless late nights preparing for big meetings. "The projections look solid." "They'd better be. My father is staking his reputation on this merger." "Our reputation," David corrected, an edge entering his voice. "I'm putting just as much on the line here." Their voices were getting closer. I glanced around frantically, then slipped behind the heavy curtains just as the office door opened. "Don't be naive," Sophia said, her voice now clear in the room. "My father brought you into this inner circle because I vouched for you. One misstep, and you'll be back pitching mid-level acquisitions faster than you can say prenuptial agreement." Through the sliver between the curtains, I could see them. David in his tailored suit, looking uncharacteristically uncertain, and Sophia, immaculate in designer workwear, her posture radiating the confidence of someone born to privilege. "That won't happen," David insisted. "The presentation is bulletproof. Eleanor helped me fine-tune it before— well, you know." Sophia laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "Ah, yes, the helpful little wife. Tell me, did she ever suspect what was really happening with Henderson?" My breath caught in my throat. "Of course not," David replied, and the dismissive certainty in his voice cut deeper than his betrayal. "Eleanor sees numbers, not strategy. She's good with spreadsheets, but she never understood the bigger picture." "Well, let's hope you've scrubbed any trace of her work from the final presentation. The last thing we need is some accountant's conservative projections undermining our narrative." "It's handled," David assured her. "Everything now reflects the growth potential we discussed." Sophia stepped closer to him, running a manicured finger down his tie. "Good, because once this merger goes through, we'll have more to celebrate than just a professional victory. My father's already talking about fast-tracking you to the executive committee." David smiled, that boyish expression I once found charming now looking calculating and cold. "I told you I was worth the investment." "Prove it on Friday?" Sophia replied, pulling him into a kiss that made my stomach turn. "Then we'll discuss your performance bonus." They left moments later, still discussing merger details as their voices faded down the hallway. I remained frozen behind the curtain, processing what I'd just witnessed. David hadn't just left me for Sophia. He'd actively colluded with her to manipulate financial projections, knowing exactly what he was doing. When I was certain they were gone, I slipped out from my hiding place, a new resolve hardening within me. This wasn't just about a husband's betrayal anymore. It was about stopping a deliberate fraud that would hurt countless innocent investors. I checked my watch again. 10 minutes until my next appointment, this one on the 3rd floor with Benjamin Hayes, Blackridge's compliance officer. I'd scheduled it under the guise of discussing the documentation needed for our divorce proceedings. But now I had something much more valuable to discuss. A first-hand account of Sophia Winters explicitly acknowledging the manipulation of merger projections. As I rode the elevator down, my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "SEC contact very interested. Wants to meet tomorrow." The pieces were falling into place. By Friday, David wouldn't just be losing a presentation, he'd be losing everything, and I was just getting started. Benjamin Hayes, Blackridge's compliance officer, looked nothing like I'd expected. Rather than the stern, humorless figure David had often described, I found myself facing a thoughtful man in his early 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Ms. Walker," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk, "how can compliance assist with your divorce documentation?" I took a moment to study him, weighing my options. My original plan had been to hint at irregularities in the Henderson merger, planting just enough doubt to trigger an internal review. But after overhearing Sophia and David, I knew a subtle approach wouldn't be enough. "Mr. Hayes, I need to be direct. I didn't come about divorce documentation." I reached into my portfolio and placed a printout of the original Henderson financial projections on his desk. "I came about this." Hayes glanced at the document, his expression carefully neutral. "These appear to be internal financial analyses. May I ask how you came to possess them?" David shared them with me weeks ago when I was helping him prepare his presentation. What he didn't realize was that I saw both versions, the accurate projections and the manipulated ones. Hayes's expression didn't change, but his posture straightened almost imperceptibly. "That's a serious allegation, Ms. Walker." "It is," I agreed, "and I wouldn't make it without evidence." I placed a second document on his desk, a side-by-side comparison I'd prepared showing the original projections versus the altered ones. The merger projections being presented to the board on Friday are fraudulent, and I have reason to believe David and Sophia Winters are fully aware of this. Hayes studied the documents for a long moment, then met my eyes directly. "Why are you bringing this to me instead of the SEC?" "Because I just came from overhearing a conversation between David and Sophia that confirms they're knowingly deceiving the board." I described what I'd heard, watching Hayes's professional composure falter as I quoted Sophia's words about conservative projections undermining their narrative. "I see." Hayes removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Ms. Walker, I'm obligated to ask, is this information being presented out of professional concern or personal grievance?" It was a fair question. "Both," I admitted. "I won't pretend that David's betrayal isn't a factor. But I've been an accountant for 15 years. I can't knowingly allow fraudulent financial information to be presented as fact, especially when innocent investors will suffer." Hayes nodded slowly. "I appreciate your honesty. Rest assured, I'll look into this immediately." "The board presentation is Friday," I reminded him. "That gives you less than 3 days." "Understood." Hayes gathered the documents carefully. "This conversation didn't happen, Ms. Walker, for your own protection." As I left his office, I checked my phone to find a message from Maggie. "News. Call me ASAP." 20 minutes later, I was back in my apartment, staring at Maggie in disbelief. "They're announcing their engagement? Already?" The words felt like gravel in my throat. Maggie nodded grimly. "It hit the society pages this morning. Apparently, they're planning to make it official at the Blackridge Foundation Gala next week." I sank onto my couch, trying to process this new blow. "We've been separated for 3 days, and he's already announcing an engagement?" "The timing isn't coincidental," Marcus said, looking up from his laptop at my dining table. "The engagement gives them a positive news story just before the board vote on the merger. Classic misdirection. Get everyone focused on the power couple romance instead of scrutinizing the deal too closely." I'd known intellectually that David and Sophia were serious, but an official engagement mere days after he'd left our 15-year relationship felt like a deliberate twist of the knife. "What's our next move?" I asked, forcing myself to focus on strategy rather than pain. "I met with my SEC contact this morning," Marcus replied. "They're very interested in the Henderson documentation, especially given the Winters family's pattern of suspicious transactions. But they need more. Ideally, communications explicitly acknowledging the fraud." "Which we don't have," Maggie sighed. "Yet," I corrected, a new determination hardening within me. "But we might have an opportunity to get them." Both turned to look at me expectantly. "The Blackridge Foundation Gala," I explained. "It's their annual fundraiser. Very exclusive, very private. All senior executives attend, including the board." "And how exactly would you get access?" Maggie asked skeptically. "I doubt David included you on the guest list." I smiled thinly. "He didn't have to. I'm already registered. We RSVP'd months ago, and with everything happening so quickly, he probably forgot to cancel my invitation." Marcus looked intrigued. "That could work. If David and Sophia are planning to announce their engagement there, they'll be distracted. It might give you an opportunity to gather more evidence." "It's too risky," Maggie argued. "What if David sees you?" "He'll be expecting me to hide in humiliation," I replied. "He'd never imagine I'd show up at a public event where he's celebrating with his new fiancée. Besides, these galas are enormous. Over 300 guests at the Winters estate." "Estate?" Marcus perked up. "The gala is at their home?" I nodded. "Charles Winters hosts it every year. Very exclusive, very private. Which means limited security cameras and potential access to areas normally off-limits," Marcus mused. "If Sophia and her father discuss the merger there, we might capture the evidence the SEC needs," I finished. Maggie looked between us, clearly concerned. "This sounds like something from a spy movie. You're talking about what? Wearing a wire? Breaking into offices? This isn't you, Eleanor." "The old me wouldn't have considered it," I admitted. "But the old me also believed in playing by the rules and supporting her husband's career. Look where that got me. My phone buzzed with a new email notification. Benjamin Hayes, using a personal Gmail account rather than his Blackridge address. Need to speak urgently. Meet at Carson's coffee shop, 7 p.m. tonight. Come alone. I showed the message to Marcus and Maggie. It could be a trap, Maggie warned immediately. Marcus was more measured. Or Hayes found something concerning enough that he doesn't want to discuss it on Blackridge Systems. Only one way to find out, I said, already reaching for my coat. Carson's coffee shop was a small, unremarkable place 10 blocks from the Blackridge offices, far enough away that the likelihood of running into other employees was minimal. I arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a corner table with a clear view of both the entrance and the emergency exit. Hayes arrived precisely at 7, carrying a worn leather briefcase. His usual polished appearance was noticeably rumpled, as if he'd been working for hours without rest. "Thank you for coming," he said, sliding into the seat across from me. I couldn't risk speaking at the office. "You found something," I guessed. Hayes glanced around before leaning forward. "I did a preliminary review of the Henderson documentation. The discrepancies are substantial, far beyond creative accounting or optimistic projections." "I know. What you may not know," Hayes continued, lowering his voice further, "is that the pattern extends beyond Henderson. Once I knew what to look for, I found similar manipulations in 3 other recent acquisitions, all overseen by Sophia Winters." My breath caught. "Can you prove it?" "That's the problem." Hayes looked genuinely troubled. Shortly after our meeting, I was called into Chairman Winters' office. He wanted to know why I was accessing secured files related to the Henderson merger. Ice formed in my stomach. "Someone reported you." Hayes nodded grimly. "I claimed it was a routine pre-board compliance review. He seemed to accept that, but—" He paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. "Ms. Walker, I've been Blackridge's compliance officer for 11 years. I've never felt personally threatened in my position until today." What did he say? Nothing. Explicit. But he reminded me that my daughter's private school tuition and my wife's medical treatments are covered by Blackridge's executive benefits package. Benefits that could be restructured in the upcoming fiscal year. The implications were clear. "He's threatening your family to keep you quiet." Hayes didn't deny it. Instead, he opened his briefcase and slid a USB drive across the table. I made copies of everything I found. Trading records, communication logs, merger documentation, all showing the same pattern of manipulation. "The SEC needs to see this." I stared at the small device. "Why give it to me? Why not go to the authorities yourself?" "Because I have a chronically ill wife and 2 children who rely on my health insurance," Hayes said simply. "And because someone needs to stop this before innocent people lose their life savings. I can't be that person, Ms. Walker, but maybe you can." As I reached for the drive, Hayes caught my wrist. "Be careful. The Winters family doesn't just influence markets, they influence people in power, judges, regulators, police commissioners. If they discover you have this information—" He didn't need to finish the thought. "I understand the risks," I assured him. "And I appreciate what you're doing." Hayes stood, straightening his tie. "I never met you. That drive doesn't exist. And on Friday, I'll be sitting in the board meeting saying nothing as David Ellis presents fraudulent projections." His expression hardened with self-loathing. Sometimes survival means compromise. After he left, I sat for several minutes, turning the USB drive over in my hands. The small device contained enough evidence to potentially bring down one of the most powerful families in finance and destroy David's career in the process. But Hayes's warning echoed in my mind. If the Winters family would threaten a loyal employee like Hayes, what would they do to the discarded wife threatening their empire? I tucked the drive into my pocket and headed for the door, already formulating the next phase of our plan. The risks had just increased exponentially, but so had the stakes. As I stepped outside, my phone buzzed with a text from David. Need to discuss property division. Lawyer suggests meeting tomorrow. For a moment, I almost laughed at the mundane normality of the message. David was worried about dividing our kitchenware while I was carrying evidence that could send him to prison. I typed back a single word. Fine. The game was changing. And for the first time since David walked out, I was the one holding the cards. The law office of Greenberg and Associates occupied the entire 42nd floor of a sleek downtown tower. I'd passed the building countless times, but never been inside. David had handled all our legal matters throughout our marriage. Another way he'd kept me dependent, I now realized. The receptionist's smile was professionally sympathetic. Ms. Walker, Mr. Ellis is already in the conference room with Mr. Greenberg. This way, please. I followed her down a hallway lined with expensive abstract art, mentally rehearsing the role I needed to play. Wounded, but reasonable. Emotional, but not hysterical. The perfect victim. David stood as I entered, his expression a carefully practiced blend of regret and resolution. Beside him sat an older man with silver hair and a $1,000 suit. Arthur Greenberg himself, not one of his associates. David was pulling out all the stops. Eleanor, David nodded, his voice gentle in a way that once would have melted my defenses. Thank you for coming. I took the seat opposite them, placing my portfolio on the polished conference table. Let's keep this brief. I have another appointment at noon. A flicker of surprise crossed David's face. In our marriage, I'd always rearranged my schedule to accommodate his priorities. This small assertion of independence seemed to unsettle him. Of course, Greenberg smiled smoothly. We've prepared a preliminary division of assets that we believe is quite generous. He slid a document across the table. Mr. Ellis is prepared to let you keep the apartment and your vehicle, plus a cash settlement of $250,000. I glanced at the paperwork without touching it. And in exchange? A clean break, David interjected. No alimony, no future claims against my assets or earnings, and he hesitated, glancing at his lawyer. And full confidentiality regarding all aspects of your marriage and separation, Greenberg finished. A standard non-disclosure agreement. I raised an eyebrow. You want me to sign an NDA about our marriage? It's routine in these situations, Greenberg assured me, particularly given Mr. Ellis's position at Blackridge and his upcoming advancement. I allowed myself a small smile. Ah, yes, the executive committee appointment. Contingent on the Henderson merger, I assume? David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. My career trajectories aren't relevant to our divorce settlement. On the contrary, I countered, opening my portfolio and removing a document of my own. They're highly relevant to what I'm prepared to accept. David exchanged a quick glance with Greenberg. We're not here to negotiate, Eleanor. This is a very generous offer, more than fair given the circumstances. The circumstances being that you left me for your boss's daughter after 15 years of marriage? I kept my voice level. Or the circumstances where I helped build your career while putting my own on hold? Eleanor. No, David. I cut him off firmly. Here are my terms. I slid my counter-proposal across the table. The apartment, yes. My car, yes. But the cash settlement will be $1.2 million representing my investment in your career over 15 years. Greenberg's eyebrows shot up. That's completely unreasonable. Is it? I asked calmly. Let's calculate my contributions. 3 relocations. For David's promotions, causing me to restart my career each time. Thousands of unpaid hours helping prepare his presentations, including the upcoming Henderson merger. Countless networking events where I connected David with key contacts. The value is actually quite conservative. David's face had flushed red. This is extortion. This is compensation, I corrected. And there's one more condition. No NDA. Absolutely not, Greenberg interjected. Mr. Ellis's privacy is non-negotiable. I leaned back in my chair. Then we have nothing more to discuss. I'll have my attorney contact you next week. Your attorney? David looked genuinely startled. Since when do you have a lawyer? Since you decided to end our marriage via text. Message, I replied, gathering my things. Did you really think I'd just accept whatever crumbs you offered, David? As I stood to leave, David reached across the table to grab my wrist. Wait, maybe we can discuss this. I looked pointedly at his hand until he released me. My terms are clear, and they expire in 48 hours, conveniently, right after your board presentation. His eyes narrowed. What does my presentation have to do with our divorce? I smiled enigmatically. Nothing at all, just an observation about timing. As I walked toward the door, Greenberg called after me. Ms. Walker, be reasonable. Mr. Ellis is trying to be fair here. I paused, turning back to face them. Fair would have been ending our marriage with dignity, instead of discarding me the moment someone with better connections came along. Fair would have been acknowledging my contributions to David's success instead of erasing me from his narrative. You want fair, Mr. Greenberg? Tell your client to reconsider my terms. The look of confusion on David's face almost made me laugh. He genuinely couldn't understand what had happened to his amenable, accommodating wife. Outside the building, I took a deep breath of fresh air, feeling lighter than I had in days. The meeting had served its purpose, not to negotiate a settlement, but to establish my unexpected resolve. The seed of doubt had been planted in David's mind, just in time to distract him before tomorrow's presentation. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. SEC meeting confirmed for 2 p.m., bringing someone important. I checked my watch. Just enough. Time to meet Maggie for our next phase of preparation. Are you absolutely certain about this? Maggie asked for the third time, examining the sleek silver recorder. Because once we cross this line, there's no going back. We were sitting in Marcus's apartment, surrounded by equipment that looked more appropriate for a spy thriller than an accountant's revenge plot. I'm certain, I confirmed. The USB drive Hayes gave me is compelling, but the SEC needs something. Irrefutable, Sophia or her father explicitly acknowledging the fraud. And you think they'll just happen to discuss their illegal activities at a charity gala? Maggie's skepticism was clear. No, Marcus interjected, adjusting something on his laptop. But they might discuss it in Charles Winter's home office, which Eleanor will have legitimate reason to visit. How so? Maggie demanded. I smiled slightly. Because the powder room nearest the main ballroom has been accidentally placed out of service. The only other facilities on that floor are down the hallway, directly past Winter's study. Marcus nodded approvingly. And with everyone focused, on David and Sophia's engagement announcement, security will be concentrated in the main reception areas. This is insane, Maggie muttered. You're not a spy, Eleanor. You're an accountant. An accountant who knows exactly what to look for, I corrected. Balance sheets, trading records, communication logs, I can identify incriminating evidence. In seconds. Assuming you can even get into his office without being caught, Maggie countered. Marcus handed me the recording device, small enough to be hidden in a compact. This has exceptional audio quality and can record for up to 6 hours. Just remember, for the recordings to be admissible, you can't break any laws to obtain them. I know. I won't break in or hack anything. If the office is locked, I walk away. Maggie still looked troubled. And what about David? What if he sees you? He'll be too busy playing the adoring fiancé to notice his discarded wife, I said, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. Besides, I'll be virtually unrecognizable. It wasn't an exaggeration. The Eleanor who had attended previous Black Ridge functions had been deliberately understated. Modest dresses, minimal makeup, hair simply styled. David had always preferred me to remain in the background, never outshining him or drawing attention. Tomorrow, I would be transformed. The black designer gown Maggie had helped me select was sophisticated and striking, with a neckline just daring enough to ensure no one would be thinking about the dutiful accountant I'd once been. My hair would be styled in an elegant updo, my makeup dramatic enough to change the angles of my face. The SEC contact seemed optimistic about the evidence we've gathered so far, Marcus said, changing the subject. With Hayes's documentation and what you've provided, they're building a solid case. But direct testimony from someone inside Blackridge would strengthen it considerably. Someone like Benjamin Hayes? I suggested. Marcus nodded. Exactly. If we can get enough evidence to force the SEC's hand, they could offer Hayes immunity in exchange for his cooperation. Saving his job and his family's health care, I murmured, thinking of the compliance officer's dilemma, while taking down the people who threatened him, Marcus added. My phone buzzed with a notification, an email from Gloria Harrington, Blackridge's HR director. Ms. Walker, I've looked into the foundation pledge matter you mentioned. There's no record of your donation in our systems, despite the documentation you provided. I'd like to discuss this further at your convenience. I showed the message to Marcus and Maggie. Another complication? Maggie sighed, but Marcus looked intrigued. Or another ally. If the HR director is already questioning financial discrepancies, she might be receptive to other concerns, I finished. I'll respond after the SEC meeting. The pieces were falling into place. Tomorrow's board presentation would publicly expose the manipulated projections. The gala would provide opportunity to gather definitive evidence. And with the SEC already building a case, what exactly did you mean about the property division terms expiring after David's presentation? Maggie asked suddenly. You don't actually expect him to pay you $1.2 million, do you? I smiled, thinking of the modified presentation waiting on David's laptop. Let's just say after tomorrow, David might be very motivated to keep me happy. The look I shared with Marcus conveyed what I couldn't say aloud. By this time tomorrow, David's career at Blackridge would be in shambles. The CTR settlement offer wasn't about money. It was about establishing a motive for what he would perceive as deliberate sabotage. We should head to the SEC meeting, Marcus said, checking his watch. My contact says she's bringing someone from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. As we gathered our things, Maggie pulled me aside. Are you sure you're ready for what comes next? Once you do this, there's no going back. Your life will never be the same. I thought about the text message that had ended my marriage, about 15 years of supporting David's dreams while deferring my own, about the casual cruelty with which he and Sophia had discussed me. My life already isn't the same, I replied quietly. The only difference is, now I'm the one choosing the direction it takes. The SEC offices awaited. And after that, the final preparations for tomorrow, the day David would discover exactly what he'd lost when he decided I was disposable. The SEC offices were coldly institutional, all fluorescent lighting and beige walls. We were escorted to a conference room where two women waited, Valerie Chen, Marcus's SEC contact, and Special Agent Diana Ortiz from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Thank you for coming, Ms. Walker, Agent Ortiz began after introductions. I understand this is a difficult personal situation for you. My personal situation is secondary, I replied, setting Hayes's USB drive on the table. This contains evidence of deliberate securities fraud involving multiple executives at Blackridge Capital, including Sophia Winters and my husband, David Ellis. Valerie raised an eyebrow at my directness. Marcus mentioned you had compelling documentation, but this seems quite comprehensive. It is, I confirmed. Benjamin Hayes, Blackridge's compliance officer, compiled most of it after I alerted him to discrepancies in the Henderson merger projections. Agent Ortiz leaned forward. And Mr. Hayes gave you this drive willingly? Yes. After Chairman Winters threatened his family's healthcare benefits if he continued investigating. The two women exchanged glances. That's concerning, Valerie acknowledged. But without Hayes's direct testimony, I understand, I interjected, which is why I'm attending the Blackridge Foundation Gala tomorrow night. I believe I can obtain recordings of Sophia or her father explicitly acknowledging the fraud. Agent Ortiz's expression was skeptical. Ms. Walker, while we appreciate your initiative, gathering evidence is our job. Citizens conducting their own investigations can compromise prosecutions. With all due respect, Agent Ortiz, Marcus intervened, Eleanor has legitimate access to the gala as David's wife. The separation is so recent that her invitation hasn't been rescinded. No laws would be broken. And I know exactly what to look for, I added. These aren't just random financial discrepancies. They're part of a systematic pattern of fraud designed to artificially inflate values related to the Henderson merger. Valerie studied me thoughtfully. And tomorrow is the board vote on this. Merger? Yes. Though I've already taken steps to ensure the board sees the actual projections rather than the manipulated ones. Agent Ortiz's eyes narrowed. What kind of steps? I explained how I'd modified David's presentation, careful to emphasize that I'd simply restored accurate data rather than inserting false information. That's creative, Valerie said carefully. But it doesn't give us what we need for charges. We need explicit acknowledgement of intent to defraud. Which is why the gala is crucial, I insisted. The Winters family will be desperate to control the narrative after David's presentation reveals the accurate projections. They'll have to discuss damage control. Agent Ortiz still looked unconvinced. This is a federal investigation, Ms. Walker, not a revenge plot. The words stung, but I maintained my composure. I'm well aware of the legal stakes, Agent Ortiz. This isn't about revenge. It's about preventing thousands of innocent investors from losing everything when this fraudulent merger inevitably collapses. Valerie intervened smoothly. Perhaps we could find a compromise. Ms. Walker attends the gala as planned, but with clear parameters about what constitutes admissible evidence. Over the next hour, we outlined a careful strategy. I would wear the recording device, but would not attempt to access any locked rooms or password-protected files. If I overheard relevant conversations, I would document them without attempting to direct or manipulate the speakers. We'll have agents stationed nearby, Agent Ortiz concluded. If you obtain anything significant, you contact us immediately. Not the press, not Blackridge's board, us. Understood, I agreed. But what about Hayes? He took an enormous risk providing this evidence. If this leads to charges, we can discuss immunity options, Valerie assured me. But first, we need those recordings. As we prepared to leave, Agent Ortiz held me back for a moment. Ms. Walker, I need to ask, are you absolutely certain your husband is knowingly involved in this fraud? Because once this moves forward, there's no protecting him, regardless of your personal relationship. I met her gaze steadily. I heard him discussing the manipulated projections with Sophia Winters. He knows exactly what he's doing. She nodded, seeming satisfied. Then I'll see you tomorrow night. Be careful. You look transformed, Marcus said appreciatively as I emerged from Maggie's bedroom the following evening. The woman in the mirror was indeed barely recognizable as the Eleanor Walker who had spent 15 years in David's shadow. The black gown was sophisticated yet daring, with an asymmetrical neckline that drew attention to my collarbones and a slit that revealed just enough leg to ensure no one would be thinking about spreadsheets. My hair, usually pulled back in a practical style, now fell in elegant waves over one shoulder. The makeup was subtle but strategic, emphasizing cheekbones I'd forgotten I had. Will David even recognize you? Maggie wondered, adjusting my diamond earrings, borrowed from her collection and worth more than my monthly salary. That's the idea, I replied. I need to be visible enough to establish my presence, but not so obvious that David immediately spots me, at least not until after his presentation disaster. Marcus checked his watch. Speaking of which, The board meeting should be wrapping up right about now. Are we ready for phase 2? I nodded, touching the small recording device concealed in my evening bag. As ready as I'll ever be. Maggie squeezed my hand. Remember, if anything feels wrong, you walk away. No evidence is worth putting yourself at risk. I'll be fine, I assured her, though my racing pulse suggested otherwise. The hard part is already done. The presentation is set to reveal the true projections. By now, David's professional reputation is in tatters. And the Winters. Family will be looking for someone to blame, Marcus reminded me. Stay focused. Get what we need, then get out. The car service Marcus had arranged arrived precisely on schedule. As we drove toward the Winters estate in the exclusive North Hills neighborhood, I mentally rehearsed my approach. The gala would be crowded with Blackridge executives, board members, and wealthy clients, most of whom would have just witnessed David's humiliation at the board meeting. Timing would be crucial. The recording device is activated, Marcus confirmed, checking the app on his phone. Remember, try to get as close as possible to any relevant conversations. The microphone is sensitive, but background noise could be an issue. I nodded, watching through the window as we approached the illuminated gates of the Winters estate. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway, disgorging passengers in formal wear. Security guards checked invitations with polite efficiency. This is it? I murmured, more to myself than to Marcus and Maggie. No turning back now. Marcus touched my arm briefly. We'll be monitoring the audio feed from the car. Any problems? Send the text signal and we'll call with your emergency. With a final deep breath, I stepped from the car and approached the entrance. The security guard barely glanced at my invitation before waving me through with a professional smile. Just like that, I was inside the lion's den. The Winters mansion was exactly as ostentatious as I'd imagined. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, priceless art displayed with calculated casualness. The main ballroom buzzed with conversation, much of it centered around clusters of Blackridge. Executives whose tense expressions told me everything I needed to know about how the board meeting had gone. I accepted a champagne flute from a passing waiter, using it as cover to scan the room. No sign of David or Sophia yet, but Chairman Winters was holding court near the grand staircase, his forced smile suggesting damage control was already underway. Keeping to the periphery, I circulated slowly, catching fragments of conversations. Complete. Disaster. The projections were nowhere near what was promised. Board is furious. Williams was practically purple. Don't understand how Ellis could have made such a fundamental error. So David was taking the blame, exactly as planned. I suppressed a smile, continuing my circuit of the room until I spotted Benjamin Hayes standing alone near a window, looking distinctly uncomfortable in his rented tuxedo. Catching his eye, I gave him an almost imperceptible nod. His expression remained neutral, but he casually moved toward the hallway leading to the restrooms. I waited 30 seconds, then followed. They're crucifying Ellis, Hayes murmured when we were briefly alone in the corridor. The board has suspended the merger vote pending a complete audit. And Sophia? I asked quietly. Damage control. She's claiming the errors were all David's, that she tried to warn him but he was too arrogant to listen. Hayes looked exhausted, the strain of the past few days evident in the shadows under his eyes. Winters pulled me aside before the gala, told me my discretion during the audit would be remembered when bonus season arrives. Another threat? An attempted bribe this time. Hayes glanced nervously over his shoulder. I should get back before. I missed, but Eleanor... He hesitated. Be careful. I overheard Sophia telling her father they need to secure the study. Whatever evidence you're hoping to find there may already be gone, I finished. Thank you for the warning. As Hayes returned to the ballroom, I checked my watch. According to the program, David and Sophia's engagement announcement was scheduled for 9:30, just 30 minutes away. If I was going to access the study, it needed to be now, while everyone was distracted by the merger fallout. Following the into Directions Marcus had memorized from the estate blueprints, legally obtained through public records, he'd assured me. I made my way past the out-of-order powder room and down the hallway toward Charles Winter's private study. Heart pounding. I tried the door. Locked. Hayes's warning had come too late. Just as I was about to turn back, voices approached from around the corner, Sophia's crisp British accent unmistakable even in anger. "This is a complete disaster, David. How could you let this happen?" "I don't understand what went wrong," David's voice replied, tension evident in every syllable. "Those weren't the projections I prepared." "Well, they're the projections the board saw, and now the entire merger is in jeopardy. Do you have any idea what this means?" With nowhere to hide, I made a split-second decision. I turned toward them and began walking confidently in their direction, praying the dramatic transformation in my appearance would buy me precious seconds of non-recognition. As we passed in the hallway, David's eyes flickered over me without interest, then widened in stunned realization. "Eleanor?" I smiled coolly, enjoying his shock. "Hello, David. Sophia. Congratulations on your engagement, though perhaps condolences might be more appropriate given how the board meeting went." Sophia recovered first, her perfect features arranging themselves into a brittle smile. "How unexpected to see you here. I wasn't aware David had included you on the guest list." "Oh, he didn't," I replied pleasantly. "But as it happens, our RSVP was submitted months ago, an oversight in your hasty transition." David's face had drained of color. "Eleanor, what are you doing here?" "Enjoying the party," I said, raising my champagne flute slightly. "It's quite the event, though the mood seems rather tense. Trouble with the Henderson presentation, I hear?" The flash of suspicion in his eyes was immensely satisfying. "You know something about that, don't you?" "About what?" I asked innocently. "Your doctored projections being replaced with accurate ones? Why would I know anything about that?" Sophia's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You interfered with Blackridge business." "No," I corrected. "I simply ensured the board received honest financial projections instead of fraudulent ones, as any ethical accountant would do." "You've made a serious mistake," Sophia said, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "My father would be very interested to know the extent of your manipulation of the Henderson numbers," I interrupted. "Not to mention the 3 previous acquisitions that show the same pattern of fraud." Both of them froze, the confirmation of their guilt written plainly across their faces. And every word was being captured by the recording device in my clutch. "How much do you want?" David asked finally. "Is that what this is about? The divorce settlement?" I laughed softly. "Oh, David, this was never about money." Before either could respond, a commotion from the ballroom interrupted us. Raised voices, the sound of breaking glass. Security personnel rushed past us toward the source of the disturbance. "Your father needs you," David told Sophia urgently. "We'll deal with her later." As they hurried toward the ballroom, I slipped my phone from my clutch and sent the predetermined text to Marcus. The recording had captured everything I needed: explicit knowledge of the fraud, an attempted bribe, and Sophia's thinly veiled threat. My part was done. Now it was time for the professionals to take over. I moved quickly toward the front entrance, adrenaline coursing through my veins. In the chaos, no one noticed as I slipped outside into the cool night air, where Marcus and Maggie waited in the idling car. "Did you get it?" Marcus asked urgently as I slid into the back seat. I nodded, unable to suppress a victorious smile. "Every word? And the distraction?" "Right on schedule," Maggie confirmed. "Anonymous tip to the business press about the board meeting disaster. They're swarming the front gates now." As we pulled away from the Winters estate, I watched in the side mirror as reporters converged on the arriving guests, cameras flashing. By morning, David and Sophia's professional humiliation would be splashed across every financial news outlet. But the real blow would come when Agent Ortiz arrived with her warrants. "Are you okay?" Maggie asked softly, studying my face. "I'm better than okay," I replied, feeling an unfamiliar sense of power. For the first time in 15 years, I'm exactly where I want to be. The next morning dawned bright and merciless, sunlight streaming through Maggie's guest room windows where I'd spent the night. My phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, missed calls from David, urgent texts, voicemails growing increasingly. Desperate as the hours passed, I ignored them all, instead opening the Financial Times app to find exactly what we'd anticipated. Blackridge Capital merger in chaos. Board suspends vote after presentation disaster. Marcus knocked softly before entering with 2 mugs of coffee. "You've made quite a splash," he observed, handing me one. "The business channels are running nothing else this morning." I scrolled through the article, savoring each devastating paragraph. The piece detailed how David's presentation had spectacularly unraveled when the projections he displayed showed the merger would actually decrease shareholder value rather than generate the promised returns. Board members were quoted, expressing shock and profound concern, with several calling for a complete audit of all recent acquisitions. "Any word from Agent Ortiz?" I asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. "She called while you were still asleep. They're executing search warrants at Blackridge headquarters this morning." Marcus looked impressed. "Your recording from last night?" Was apparently exactly what they needed. Sophia's acknowledgement of the manipulated projections plus the attempted bribe sealed it. My phone buzzed again, David's name flashing on the screen for the 20th time. With a sigh, I finally answered, putting it on speaker so Marcus could hear. "What the hell did you do, Eleanor?" David's voice was ragged with fury and panic. "Good morning to you too, David," I replied calmly. "I take it the board meeting didn't go well?" "You know damn well it didn't. You tampered with my presentation." The accusation echoed through Maggie's sunlit kitchen. "I didn't tamper with anything," I corrected. "I simply ensured the board saw the actual projections instead of the fraudulent ones you and Sophia created. Those numbers were confidential Blackridge property. Do you have any idea what you've done? The SEC is here. They're seizing computers, files, everything." I couldn't help but smile at his obliviousness. "How unfortunate for you." "This isn't a joke." David's voice cracked with strain. "They're saying it's securities fraud. Criminal charges, Eleanor. I could go to prison." "Perhaps you should have thought of that before you decided to participate in a scheme to defraud investors," I suggested mildly. "Or before you ended our 15-year marriage with a text message." The line went silent for a moment. When David spoke again, his tone had shifted from anger to calculation. "I've been thinking about your settlement proposal. The $1.2 million, I'm prepared to accept it." Marcus raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed by David's transparent attempt at manipulation. "How generous of you," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "Unfortunately, that offer expired yesterday, as I clearly stated. And given this morning's developments, I'm afraid any future settlement discussions will need to involve the FBI's Financial Crimes Division." "You don't understand." David's voice dropped to a desperate whisper. "Sophia's father is looking for someone to blame. They're going to pin everything on me." "That does seem to be the strategy she was pursuing at the gala last night," I agreed. "Right before she inadvertently admitted knowledge of the fraud, on a recording that's now in federal hands." Another long silence. "You were wearing a wire." "It wasn't a question. Technically, it was a digital recording device, much more reliable than the old-fashioned kind." "Why?" The single word contained a universe of betrayal, rich coming from the man who had discarded me without a second thought. "Because securities fraud is a federal crime, David. Because innocent people would have lost their life savings when the Henderson merger inevitably collapsed. Because Benjamin Hayes was threatened when he tried to do the right thing." I paused. And yes, because you ended our marriage with a text message after 15 years, as if I were nothing more than an inconvenient subscription you were canceling. I made a mistake, David said, his voice suddenly soft. The conciliatory tone he'd always used when trying to manipulate me. We can fix this, Eleanor. Together. Like we always have. For a moment, I felt a flicker of our old connection, the partnership I'd believed in for 15 years. But then I remembered the casual cruelty in his voice when he'd discussed me with Sophia. Eleanor sees numbers, not strategy. She never understood the bigger picture. No, David. We can't fix this. Some things can't be fixed. Please, he whispered, desperation naked in his voice. I'll lose everything. Yes, I agreed softly. You will. I ended the call, setting the phone down carefully on Maggie's marble countertop. Marcus studied me with newfound respect. Are you okay? He asked after a moment. Better than okay? I replied honestly. For the first time in years, I feel free. My phone buzzed again, but this time it was Agent Ortiz. Ms. Walker, we need you to come to the field office. The case is moving quickly, and there are some developments you should be aware of. The FBI field office hummed with focused energy. Agent Ortiz met me in the lobby, her sharp eyes taking in my composed demeanor. Thank you for coming, she said, leading me through a labyrinth of secure corridors. Your recording has proven extremely valuable. Combined with the evidence from Hayes's USB drive, we have more than enough to pursue charges. Against Sophia and her father? I asked. Among others. Her expression was professionally neutral. That's partly why I asked you here. We've received overtures from several Blackridge executives looking to make deals. Your husband among them. My step faltered slightly. David wants to cooperate? He's offered to testify against the Winters family in exchange for reduced charges. Agent Ortiz led me into a conference room where Valerie Chen from the SEC waited alongside a distinguished, older man I didn't recognize. Ms. Walker, this is U.S. Attorney Philip Garrison. He's overseeing the case. Garrison stood to shake my hand, his grip firm and assessing. Ms. Walker, your assistance has been instrumental in breaking this case. We're building what appears to be one of the most significant securities fraud prosecutions of the past decade. The Winters family has been manipulating markets for years, Valerie added. The Henderson merger was just the latest in a pattern that stretches back nearly a decade. What happens now? I asked, taking a seat at the conference table. Agent Ortiz exchanged glances with Garrison before responding. That depends partly on you. Mr. Ellis has offered substantial testimony implicating Sophia and Charles Winters, but his credibility is complicated by your personal relationship. You mean because we're in the middle of a divorce? I clarified. Precisely, Garrison nodded. The defense will inevitably claim his cooperation was coerced or influenced by personal animus. Your testimony regarding what you personally witnessed would help corroborate his account. I considered this carefully. Are you asking me to help David get a reduced sentence? We're asking you to help us bring down the people truly responsible for orchestrating this fraud, Agent Ortiz corrected gently. Based on what we've uncovered, your husband appears to have been brought into an existing scheme rather than initiating it himself. He's still culpable, I insisted. Absolutely, Garrison agreed, and he will face consequences. But in terms of prosecutorial priorities, the Winters family represents the greater threat to market integrity. I thought about David's desperate phone call that morning, about the text message that had ended our marriage. About 15 years of partnership dissolved in an instant when someone better came along. What would you need from me? I asked finally. A formal statement regarding the conversations you overheard between your husband and Sophia Winters, your professional assessment of the financial documents you reviewed, and potentially testimony before a grand jury. And in exchange, Agent Ortiz's expression softened slightly. We can't offer you anything in exchange, Ms. Walker. You're a witness, not a defendant. But I can tell you that your cooperation would significantly strengthen the case against the primary architects of this fraud. I considered my options carefully. Refusing to cooperate might hurt the Winters family's prosecution, but would certainly ensure David faced maximum penalties. Yet the goal had never been David's destruction. It had been justice for the fraud, and yes, a reckoning for his betrayal. I'll cooperate, I decided, but I want something in return. Garrison frowned. As Agent Ortiz explained, "Not from you," I clarified. "From Blackridge. Benjamin Hayes and his family were threatened when he tried to do the right thing. I want assurances that his position is protected." Agent Ortiz looked surprised, then thoughtful. "That might actually be feasible. The board will be eager to demonstrate their commitment to ethical compliance in the wake of this scandal. Protecting a whistleblower would send the right message." "Then, we have a deal," I said, extending my hand to Garrison. "I'll tell you everything I know about the Henderson fraud." As we shook hands, my phone buzzed with a new email notification. David's attorney, requesting an urgent meeting to discuss settlement terms in light of recent developments. The desperation was palpable even in the formal legal language. I silenced the phone, turning my attention to Agent Ortiz's questions. David's problems were no longer my concern. He had made his choice when he decided I wasn't good enough for his new life. Now, he would live with the consequences. As I detailed everything I'd discovered about the Henderson fraud, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. Not just the burden of knowledge, but the heavier burden of trying to be someone I wasn't. The woman sitting in an FBI conference room, precisely dissecting financial fraud schemes, was the real Eleanor Walker, sharp, capable, and finally, completely undiminished. "One last thing," Agent Ortiz said as we concluded. "There will likely be significant media interest in this case. As Mr. Ellis's wife, soon-to-be ex-wife," I corrected. "Of course, in either case, you may face unwanted attention. We can arrange security if necessary." I considered this, then shook my head. "That won't be needed. I can handle whatever comes." And for the first time in 15 years, I truly believed it. The next week unfolded like a financial thriller I couldn't have scripted better myself. The Blackridge scandal dominated business news, with new revelations emerging daily as the investigation expanded. Stocks plummeted, executives resigned, and the Henderson merger was officially terminated. I watched it all from the unexpected sanctuary of Maggie's guest room, declining all interview requests and keeping a deliberately low profile. The media had initially labeled me the vengeful wife, until Marcus strategically leaked select details emphasizing the fraud aspect over the personal betrayal. The narrative quickly shifted to whistleblower accountant, a characterization I found far more palatable. "You're trending again," Maggie announced, entering with her morning coffee and her tablet displaying various news sites. "The Wall Street Journal is calling you the accountant who brought down a financial empire." I grimaced. Hardly accurate. The Winters family brought themselves down through their own greed. "Don't diminish what you did," Marcus countered, joining us at the breakfast table. "Without your intervention, they would have successfully executed the Henderson fraud, just as they had with previous acquisitions." My phone buzzed with a text from Gloria Harrington, Blackridge's HR director. "Board emergency meeting concluded. Hayes confirmed as permanent chief compliance officer with expanded authority. Your condition has been met." I showed the message to Marcus and Maggie. "One good outcome, at least," Marcus nodded approvingly. "Hayes and his family are protected." "What about the rest of the employees?" I asked. The human cost of the scandal had been weighing on me. Hundreds of Blackridge staff who had nothing to do with the fraud, now facing uncertainty as the company's future hung in the balance. "The board is bringing in crisis management," Maggie reported, scanning a news article. They're distancing themselves from the Winters family, claiming they were deceived along with everyone else. Standard damage control. And David? The question slipped out before I could stop it. Marcus and Maggie exchanged glances. You haven't seen today's updates? Marcus asked carefully. I've been avoiding the coverage, I admitted. The constant speculation about my marriage had become exhausting. Marcus handed me his phone, open to a breaking news alert. Blackridge executive David Ellis released on $2 million bail following fraud charges. The accompanying photo showed David, leaving the federal courthouse, looking haggard and defeated in a rumpled suit that would have been unthinkable in his previous life. Sophia was conspicuously absent. His attorney gave a statement saying he was manipulated by the Winters family and is fully cooperating with authorities, Maggie added gently. I stared at the photo, feeling a complex mix of emotions I couldn't quite name. The man in the image was barely recognizable as the confident, ambitious partner I'd spent 15 years with. Are you okay? Maggie asked, watching me carefully. I'm fine, I replied automatically. Then, more honestly, I don't know how I feel. I wanted accountability, but seeing it happen is different, Marcus finished. That's normal, Eleanor. You spent a third of your life with him. My phone rang, interrupting the moment. Agent Ortiz's name flashed on the screen. Ms. Walker, good morning. I wanted to update you personally. Charles and Sophia Winters were taken into custody an hour ago. The charges include securities fraud, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice. I saw that David has been released on bail, I said, keeping my voice neutral. Yes, his cooperation has been extensive. The U.S. attorney is considering a reduced charge in exchange for his testimony against the Winters family. I absorbed this information silently. David would likely avoid the worst consequences of his actions, again, by sacrificing others. There's something else, Agent Ortiz continued. In the course of our investigation, we've uncovered evidence that may be relevant to your divorce proceedings. Financial accounts that Mr. Ellis apparently concealed from both you and the authorities. Breath caught. What kind of accounts? Offshore holdings, primarily. Established approximately 3 years ago, around the time of the Meridian acquisition. The amounts are substantial. 3 years ago, while we were still happily married, or so I'd believed. While I was managing our household on a careful budget, David had been secretly stashing funds beyond my reach. How substantial? I asked, my accountant's precision asserting itself through the shock. Initial estimates suggest approximately $4.8 million. The figure hung in the air like an accusation. All those years of careful budgeting, of delayed vacations and modest celebrations, of putting his career first because we're investing in our future, while he built a secret financial escape hatch. I see, I said finally. Thank you for telling me. The funds have been frozen pending the investigation, but you should consult your divorce attorney. As his spouse at the time these accounts were established, you may have legal claims to these assets. She paused. I should also mention that Mr. Ellis has been trying to contact you through our office. He's quite persistent. I'm sure he is, I replied dryly, now that he needs my help again. After ending the call, I relayed the information to Marcus and Maggie, whose expressions cycled through shock to outrage on my behalf. $4.8 million? Maggie repeated incredulously. While you were clipping coupons and buying department store clothes? Apparently, I confirmed, surprised by my own calm. Perhaps I had already reached my quota of shock where David was concerned. You need to call Arthur Klein, Marcus insisted, referring to the divorce attorney he had connected me with. This changes everything about your settlement negotiations. It does, I agreed, already dialing the number. Arthur Klein's office projected exactly the confidence his formidable reputation suggested. Leather-bound law books, tasteful art, and furnishings that whispered rather than shouted their expense. These Offshore accounts transform your position entirely, he explained, reviewing the preliminary documentation Agent Ortiz had provided. Not only were these marital assets that Mr. Ellis concealed, but their establishment coincides with potentially fraudulent activities at Blackridge. Meaning? Meaning the court will take an extremely dim view of his financial deception, particularly given the criminal context. Additionally, the fact that he established these accounts while you were managing household finances on a restrictive budget suggests a deliberate intent to deprive you of marital assets. I absorbed this, thinking of all the times David had insisted we couldn't afford certain expenses: my professional development courses, repairs to my aging car, visits to my mother in Arizona. All while millions sat in accounts I knew nothing about. "What's our approach?" I asked finally. Klein smiled thinly. "Aggressive but measured. We request immediate freezing of all marital assets pending full financial disclosure, with specific reference to the newly discovered accounts. We position you as the wronged spouse both personally and financially, emphasizing your cooperation with federal authorities despite his betrayal. And realistically, what can I expect? Given the circumstances, his legal jeopardy, the hidden assets, the 15-year marriage where you sacrificed your own career advancement, I would anticipate a settlement heavily weighted in your favor. Possibly as high as 75–80% of the marital assets, including the offshore funds. The figure was staggering. Even a 50% share of the hidden accounts would transform my financial reality completely. His attorney has been calling daily, I noted, increasingly desperate to schedule settlement discussions. Of course, Klein nodded. Mr. Ellis is facing potential criminal penalties and career destruction. Resolving the divorce quickly and quietly would be one less front to fight on. He studied me thoughtfully. "May I ask what you want from this settlement, Ms. Walker, beyond the financial aspects?" The question caught me off guard. What did I want? When this all began, it had been about justice, making David face consequences for his betrayal and stopping the fraud that would harm innocent investors. But now? I hesitated, searching for the right words. I want acknowledgement, not just of the financial contributions he hid, but of the years I spent supporting his career at the expense of my own. The partnerships I helped him build, the strategies I helped him develop. I want the truth recognized. Klein nodded slowly. Then that's what we'll pursue. Financial compensation is straightforward. Recognition and acknowledgement require a different approach. As we discussed strategy, my phone buzzed with yet another call from David. For the first time in days, I decided to answer, putting it on speaker so Klein could hear. "Eleanor," David's voice was a blend of relief and calculation. "Thank you for finally taking my call. We need to talk." "About the $4.8 million you hid from me?" I asked calmly. "Or about something else?" The silence that followed confirmed he hadn't expected me to know about the accounts. "The feds told you," he said finally. "Look, I can explain." "I'm with my attorney now, David," I interrupted. "Arthur Klein. Any explanation should go through him." "Your attorney?" The surprise in his voice was almost comical. "Since when do you have—" "Never mind. Eleanor, we need to handle this privately. Between us. Like we always have." "Like we always have," I repeated. "You mean with you making decisions and me supporting them? That arrangement ended when you ended our marriage." "This situation is more complicated than you understand," he insisted, his tone shifting to the patronizing one he'd often used when explaining complex business matters to me. "Actually, Mr. Ellis," Klein interjected smoothly, "I believe my client understands the situation perfectly. She's aware of your legal jeopardy, your cooperation agreements with federal prosecutors, and most importantly, your deliberate concealment of substantial marital assets." Another long silence. "Who is this again?" "Arthur Klein of Klein, Brandenburg and Associates. I'll be representing Ms. Walker in your divorce proceedings." All future communications should come through my office. My assistant will send our availability for preliminary settlement discussions. Settlement discussions? David's voice rose slightly. Eleanor, be reasonable. This is hardly the time to be making financial demands, given everything that's happening. On the contrary, I replied. It seems like exactly the right time to ensure full disclosure of all marital assets before any further legal complications arise. What does that mean? The edge of panic in his voice was unmistakable. Klein answered for me. It means, Mr. Ellis, that the federal prosecutors currently considering your cooperation agreement would likely be interested in any additional financial improprieties you've failed to disclose. My client has been an exemplary witness for their case. I imagine they'd take her concerns quite seriously. The threat was elegant in its simplicity. David's cooperation deal hinged on complete honesty with prosecutors. If they believed he was still concealing assets or information. I'll have my attorney contact you, David said finally, defeat evident in his voice. As the call ended, Klein gave me an approving nod. Well handled. He's on the defensive now, which is exactly where we want him. For the first time since David's betrayal, I felt a genuine sense of resolution approaching. Not just revenge, but restoration of my financial security, my professional identity, and most importantly, my sense of self-worth. What now? I asked. Klein. Now, he replied, gathering his notes. We prepare to negotiate from a position of absolute strength. And we make David Ellis regret every moment he underestimated you. The conference room at Klein's office hummed with tense energy. On one side of the polished mahogany table, Arthur Klein sat beside me, documents meticulously arranged before him. Across from us, David and his attorney, Richard Greenberg, looked distinctly uncomfortable. 2 weeks had passed since our phone confrontation. In that time, the Blackridge scandal had deepened, with 3 additional executives indicted and the company's stock losing nearly 40% of its value. Charles Winters had been denied bail, while Sophia had been released on house arrest with a $10 million bond. A stark contrast to her plans for a lavish engagement party at the Winters estate. Shall we begin? Klein suggested, his tone pleasant, but unyielding. We've reviewed your initial settlement proposal, Mr. Greenberg, and frankly, it's inadequate. Greenberg, visibly less confident than during our first meeting, cleared his throat. My client is facing extraordinary circumstances. His financial future is uncertain given the ongoing legal proceedings. His financial future became uncertain the moment he chose to participate in securities fraud, Klein countered smoothly. And more relevant to our discussion, the moment he concealed $4.8 million in marital assets from his wife of 15 years. David wouldn't meet my eyes, staring, instead at his folded hands on the table. His designer suit hung slightly loose, as if he'd lost weight, and shadows darkened the skin beneath his eyes. Part of me, a small, distant part, almost felt sorry for him. Almost. We're prepared to increase the settlement offer to $500,000. Greenberg proposed, along with the apartment and vehicle as previously discussed. Klein didn't bother hiding his amusement. That's still not remotely close to an equitable division of marital assets, particularly given the recently discovered offshore accounts. Those accounts are currently frozen by federal authorities, Greenberg reminded us. They may be subject to fines and forfeitures depending on the outcome of the criminal case. A case in which Mr. Ellis is cooperating to reduce his own exposure, Klein noted. And regardless of their current status, the accounts represent marital assets deliberately concealed from Ms. Walker during their marriage. The court will take an extremely dim view of such deception. David finally spoke, his voice lacking its usual confidence. What exactly are you asking for, Eleanor? Klein gave me a subtle nod, our prearranged signal that I could take the lead if I wished. I'd prepared for this moment, rehearsing my points carefully. Full disclosure of all financial assets, first and foremost, I began, my voice steady despite. the tension coiling in my stomach. Followed by an equitable division that acknowledges my contributions to your career and the opportunities I sacrificed for your advancement. David's expression tightened. Your contributions to my career? The relocations I accepted for your promotions, setting back my own professional advancement each time. The networking I did with partners and clients. The presentations I helped prepare, including the Henderson merger. I maintained eye contact, refusing to be diminished. 15 years of partnership that you ended with a text message when someone with better connections came along. That's not fair, David protested. But the objection sounded hollow even to him. What's not fair, I continued, is discovering that while I was budgeting carefully for our household expenses, you were secretly transferring millions to offshore accounts I knew nothing about. Greenberg intervened, clearly sensing his client's growing discomfort. We're prepared to acknowledge undisclosed assets and adjust our offer accordingly. However, Mr. Ellis's cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors hinges on his ability to pay potential fines and restitution. How convenient, Klein observed dryly. However, those potential obligations don't supersede existing marital property rights. Ms. Walker is entitled to her fair share regardless of Mr. Ellis's subsequent legal troubles. The negotiation continued for nearly 2 hours, with offers and counteroffers exchanged in increasingly technical terms. Throughout, David grew visibly more agitated, while Greenberg struggled to maintain a coherent strategy. Finally, Klein tapped his pen against his legal pad. I believe we've reached an impasse. Unless Mr. Ellis is prepared to substantially improve his offer, we'll need to proceed to formal discovery and potentially trial. That would be unwise, Greenberg cautioned. Given the public nature of the Blackridge scandal, a contentious divorce proceeding would only generate additional negative publicity. For whom? Klein asked innocently. Ms. Walker has been widely praised as a whistleblower who helped expose significant financial fraud. Mr. Ellis, on the other hand, he left the implication hanging. David's reputation was already in tatters. A public divorce revealing his financial deception would only cement his disgrace. May I speak with Eleanor privately? David asked suddenly. Both attorneys looked surprised by the request. Klein turned to me, eyebrows raised in silent question. 5 minutes, I agreed after a moment's consideration. In the adjacent conference room. As David and I moved to the smaller room next door, I caught Klein's reassuring nod. He would be watching through the glass wall that separated the spaces, close enough to intervene if necessary. David closed the door behind us, running, a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration I'd seen countless times during our marriage. This isn't you, Eleanor, he began, his tone almost pleading. The hardball negotiations, the threats, the lawyers. This isn't who we are. No, this is exactly who I am, I corrected him. You just never bothered to notice. And there is no we anymore, David. You made that abundantly clear when you left. He winced. I made a mistake. A terrible, inexcusable mistake. Which one? I asked coolly. Leaving me? The securities fraud? Or the hidden millions? All of it. He moved closer, lowering his voice. Look, I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I'm drowning here, Eleanor. The feds, the lawyers, the media. I've lost everything. How terrible for you, I replied, unable to keep the edge from my voice, to lose everything because of your own choices. I know. He held up his hands in a placating gesture. I deserve all of it. But please, can't we handle this between ourselves, like we used to, without the lawyers turning it into warfare? The earnest desperation in his eyes might once have swayed me. For 15 years, I'd been the understanding wife, the supportive partner who helped solve David's problems. It would be so easy to fall back into that familiar pattern. But the woman who had stood by David unquestioningly no longer existed. In her place was someone stronger, clearer about her own worth. No, David, we can't. Because I no longer trust you to be honest with me. You hid millions while telling me we couldn't afford to replace my 10-year-old car. You discussed me with contempt while I was helping prepare the very presentation that advanced your career. You ended our marriage when someone better came along, only to come crawling back when she abandoned you. His face flushed with a mixture of shame and anger. That's not fair. None of this is fair, I agreed. But it's reality. Your reality, created by your choices. So this is revenge? He asked, an edge entering his voice. Making me pay because I hurt you? This isn't revenge, I corrected him. This is consequence. This is me valuing myself enough to demand what I'm legally and morally entitled to. Something I should have done years ago. David stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. Perhaps he was. What do you want? He asked finally, defeat evident in his slumped shoulders. Everything I outlined in our counterproposal. Full financial disclosure. Equitable division of all assets, including the offshore accounts. And a public acknowledgement of my contributions to your career. Public acknowledgement? His voice rose in disbelief. You want me to humiliate myself further? I want you to tell the truth, I clarified. The same truth you're presumably telling federal prosecutors, that I helped develop strategies, including for the Henderson merger, that my financial expertise was integral to your success, that our marriage was a partnership that you betrayed, professionally and personally. He was silent for a long moment, weighing his options, which I knew were severely limited. And if I agree to this, then we settle quickly, quietly, and you can focus on your cooperation agreement without the distraction of a contentious divorce. David's calculating mind was visibly working, assessing risks and benefits. Finally, he nodded. All right, I'll agree to your terms, but I want one thing in return. You're hardly in a position to make demands, I noted. Not a demand, a request. His voice softened. I want you to know that I really did love you, Eleanor. For most of our marriage. The person I became at Blackridge, the one who could discard 15 years with a text message. That's not who I want to be. Perhaps it was the unexpected vulnerability, or simply the final acknowledgement of what we'd lost. But I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, but a release of the bitter anger I'd been carrying. I believe you, I said finally. But it doesn't change anything. I know. The resignation in his voice was complete. I'll tell Greenberg to accept your terms. As we returned to the main conference room, I caught a glimpse of my reflection. In the glass wall, straight-backed, clear-eyed, undiminished. The woman looking back at me bore little resemblance to the one who had sat sobbing on the edge of our bed just weeks ago, destroyed by a text message. We're prepared to accept Ms. Walker's terms, David announced to the surprised attorneys. All of them. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur of technical details and schedules for executing the agreement. Throughout, I maintained a professional composure, even as I watched David sign away much of his remaining financial security. It wasn't until I was alone in the elevator, descending from Klein's office, that I finally allowed myself to acknowledge what had just happened. David Ellis, the man who had deemed me not good enough for his new life, had just surrendered to my terms completely. The victory brought neither joy nor satisfaction, only a quiet sense of justice finally served. As the elevator doors opened to the lobby, I stepped forward into whatever came next, finally free of the weight of being underestimated. 3 months after the settlement meeting, I stood in the empty apartment that had once been our home, now solely mine. The movers had just left with the last of David's remaining possessions, books, artwork, and mementos he'd been allowed to collect under the supervision of his attorney. Our lives, once so entwined, were now officially and completely separate. My phone buzzed with a text from Maggie. Saw the news. You okay? The news was everywhere. Impossible to miss even if I'd tried. David's plea deal had been finalized and announced that morning. In exchange for his testimony against the Winters family and other Blackridge executives, he would serve 14 months in a minimum security facility, followed by 3 years of supervised release. The financial penalties were substantial, $1.2 million in fines plus restitution to affected investors. What little remained of his assets after our divorce settlement would be effectively wiped out. He texted back, "I'm fine. Just finished clearing out the apartment." Maggie's response was immediate. "Coming over with wine and takeout. No arguments." I smiled, grateful for her persistence. The emotions of the day were more complex than I'd anticipated. Not regret. Exactly, but a strange melancholy at the final dissolution of 15 years of shared history. While waiting for Maggie, I wandered through rooms that felt both familiar and foreign. The space was mine now, but I'd already decided to sell it. Too many memories. Too much of David's presence lingered in the crown molding he'd insisted on, the kitchen he'd redesigned to his specifications, the master bathroom where his expensive toiletries had once crowded the counter. My phone rang. Marcus this time. "I just read the plea announcement," he said without preamble. 14 months seems light given the scope of the fraud. "The prosecutors got what they wanted," I replied, settling onto the window seat that overlooked the park. David's testimony apparently provided the final evidence they needed against Charles Winters. The case against him is ironclad now. And Sophia? Also pleading guilty, from what I understand. Her deal involves no prison time but a lifetime ban from the securities industry and forfeiture of most of her assets. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who had taken David from me had ultimately lost everything herself. "Poetic justice," Marcus observed. "Though the real victory is yours. Have you seen the financial press coverage of your settlement terms?" I had. The public acknowledgement of my contributions to David's career, a condition I'd insisted on, had generated unexpected attention in business circles. Former Blackridge executive acknowledges wife's uncredited role in Henderson's strategy read. One headline, "The Invisible Partner, How Eleanor Walker Shaped Blackridge Deals Without Recognition," declared another. "It's surreal," I admitted. "I never wanted publicity." "Maybe not," Marcus agreed, "but there's value in having the truth recognized, especially for other women in similar situations." After we hung up, I checked my email to find 3 new messages from financial firms inquiring about my availability for consulting positions. My professional reputation, once overshadowed by David's career, was now standing on its own, bolstered by what the business press had dubbed financial forensic skills that uncovered a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. Maggie stood in the hallway, loaded down with bags from our favorite Thai restaurant and a bottle of champagne. "I know I said wine," she explained, bustling past me into the kitchen, "but this felt more like a champagne occasion. The final chapter of David Ellis is officially closed." I followed her, watching as she efficiently unpacked containers. "Is it wrong that I don't feel more, I don't know, victorious?" Maggie paused, studying me carefully. "No. It would be weird if you were celebrating someone you loved going to prison, even after what he did." She resumed setting out the food. "Besides, this was never about destroying David. It was about justice. For you, for the investors who would have been defrauded, for Hayes and his family." "You're right," I agreed, helping her locate plates in the half-packed kitchen. "I just feel empty. Like now that it's over, I'm not sure what comes next." "That's called freedom," Maggie said gently. "The freedom to decide what you want without consideration for David's career or preferences. It's unfamiliar territory." The champagne cork popped with a satisfying sound as Maggie filled 2 glasses. "To new beginnings," she proposed, raising hers in a toast. To new beginnings, I echoed, though uncertainty lingered beneath the words. As we ate, Maggie updated me on the continuing fallout at Blackridge. The company was undergoing a complete restructuring, with most of the senior leadership replaced. Benjamin Hayes had been instrumental in implementing new compliance systems, his position more secure than ever. He sent me a thank you note, I mentioned, remembering the handwritten card that had arrived yesterday. Said his daughter's medical treatments have been approved for another year under the company's insurance. One life genuinely improved. Maggie nodded approvingly. What about the others, though? I asked. The regular employees who had nothing to do with the fraud, but lost jobs or savings when Blackridge stock collapsed. Maggie's expression softened. You can't take responsibility for that, Eleanor. The Winters family and executives like David caused those consequences. Not you. I know. Intellectually, I know that. But still. I trailed off, struggling to articulate the nagging discomfort that had been growing since the plea announcement. You have too much empathy for your own good, Maggie declared, refilling our glasses. Even for people who hurt you. Perhaps she was right. Despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to feel satisfaction at the complete destruction of David's life and career. The man I'd married, the ambitious but idealistic economics student who'd once dreamed of creating financial systems that actually helped people, had been buried somewhere beneath years of Blackridge's toxic culture and his own worst instincts. Enough about David, Maggie decided, changing the subject. Let's talk about you. 3 consulting offers in 1 week is impressive. I smiled weakly. They're more interested in the whistleblower who brought down Blackridge than in my actual financial skills. So prove them wrong, Maggie challenged. Show them exactly how valuable those skills are. My phone buzzed again. A text from Agent Ortiz. Winter's trial date set for February. Prosecution may need additional testimony from you. Available to discuss next week? The message was a reminder that while David's chapter might be ending, the larger story of the Blackridge fraud continued. My role in it wasn't quite finished. What's that? Maggie asked, noting my thoughtful expression. Just the FBI. The Winters trial is moving forward. Are you ready for that? More testimony? More public attention? I considered the question carefully. 3 months ago, the prospect would have terrified me. Now, after weathering the media scrutiny of the scandal and divorce, after standing firm against David's manipulation attempts, after rebuilding my professional identity from the ground up, it seemed merely another challenge to navigate. I think I am, I realized, somewhat surprised. By my own confidence, Maggie raised her glass again. To Eleanor Walker 2-2, stronger, wiser, and infinitely less willing to put up with anyone's bullshit. I laughed genuinely for what felt like the first time in days. I'll drink to that. Later, after Maggie had left and I was alone in the quiet apartment, my phone lit up with a notification I'd been half expecting, half dreading all day. An email from David, sent from the account he was permitted to use for personal matters while awaiting his surrender date. For long moments, I stared at the unopened message, finger hovering over the delete button. Part of me wanted to erase it unread, a final act of separation from the man who had so casually discarded me. But curiosity and something deeper, perhaps a need for real closure, won out. The message was brief. Eleanor, by the time you read this, the plea deal will be public. I report to Allenwood in 3 weeks. Before I go, I wanted to say what I couldn't seem to articulate properly during our last meetings. You were right about everything. The fraud, the hidden accounts, the way I diminished your contributions over the years. The man I became at Blackridge was someone I never intended to be. But that's not an excuse. It's simply a fact I'm trying to face honestly now that everything has collapsed. Sophia hasn't contacted me since her own plea negotiations began. The irony isn't lost on me that I left someone loyal and genuine for someone who abandoned me at the first sign of trouble. Another consequence I've earned. I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. But I wanted you to know that the public acknowledgement of your role in my career wasn't just a settlement condition I fulfilled. It was the truth I should have recognized years ago. The life you build from here will be extraordinary because you are. I see that clearly now, too late. David, I read the message twice, searching for the manipulative angle, the hidden agenda. But for perhaps the first time in years, David's words seemed genuinely transparent, not a calculation or strategy, just a final truth-telling before the consequences of his actions fully descended. I closed the email without responding. Perhaps someday I would. Tonight, it was enough to recognize that while David had indeed lost everything, I had found something far more valuable, myself. Setting the phone aside, I moved to the window that overlooked the city. Lights sparkled across the skyline, representing countless lives and stories unfolding in parallel to my own. Somewhere in that vastness was the next chapter of Eleanor Walker's life, not defined by being David's wife or Blackridge's whistleblower, but by choices entirely my own. For the first time since receiving that devastating text message months ago, I felt not just resignation or grim satisfaction, but genuine anticipation for what came next. The future stretched before me, unmarked and full of possibility. It was time to start writing it on my own terms. 1 year later, I stood at the podium of the National Conference for Financial Ethics, looking out over a sea of attentive faces. The journey from discarded wife to keynote speaker had been unexpected, to say the least. The patterns were there all along, I explained, advancing to the next slide in my presentation. Not just in the manipulated projections, but in the corporate culture that enabled them. In environments where ethical concerns are treated as obstacles rather than safeguards, fraud doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in increments. The audience, financial professionals, compliance officers, and industry regulators, nodded in recognition. Many had witnessed similar patterns in their own institutions, though perhaps not with the dramatic consequences of Blackridge. Blackridge case study isn't just about securities fraud, I continued. It's about the ecosystem that nurtures misconduct and silences those who question it. It's about what happens when we value appearance over substance, status over integrity. As I finished my presentation, the applause was warm and sustained. During the Q&A session that followed, a young woman in the third row raised her hand. Ms. Walker, your exposure of the Henderson fraud is well documented, but given the personal connection, your marriage to one of the key participants, was there ever a moment when you hesitated to come forward? The question was asked respectfully, but the underlying curiosity was clear. How had I found the strength to bring down my own husband? Of course I hesitated, I answered honestly. Not because I questioned whether the fraud should be exposed, but because I understood the personal cost of being the one to expose it. Whistleblowers often face isolation, retaliation, and public scrutiny. I wasn't immune to those fears. I paused, considering how much of my personal story to share. Over the past year, I'd learned to balance transparency with appropriate boundaries. What ultimately compelled me to act wasn't anger at my ex-husband's betrayal, though many media narratives framed it that way. It was the realization that thousands of investors, real people with retirement funds and college savings, would suffer tangible harm from this deception. Once I understood the scope of the fraud, remaining silent wasn't an option. The session concluded with thoughtful discussion about creating corporate environments where ethical concerns could be raised without fear of retaliation. As attendees gathered their materials, Benjamin Hayes approached the podium, his expression warm. "Excellent presentation, Eleanor," he said. "You managed to make compliance sound almost exciting." I laughed. The highest compliment a compliance officer could give. In the year since the Blackridge scandal, Hayes and I had developed a genuine friendship. As Blackridge's new ethics and compliance director, he had implemented significant reforms, many based on recommendations from my consulting work. "How's the family?" I asked as we walked toward the networking reception. "Thriving," he replied with evident relief. "Amy's latest treatments are showing real progress, and with the new health insurance protocols we've implemented, other employees with chronic conditions are finally getting proper coverage." It was outcomes like these, tangible improvements in people's lives, that had helped me reconcile with the aftermath of the Blackridge exposure. While the scandal had indeed cost jobs and shareholder value in the short term, the restructured company that emerged was fundamentally healthier and more ethical. "And you?" Hayes asked. "Marcus mentioned your consulting firm is expanding." "Just hired 2 new analysts," I confirmed. "Turns out there's significant demand for experts in detecting financial manipulation." Who knew? After the reception, I returned to my hotel room to find several messages waiting. The first was from Maggie, a selfie of her holding up a magazine with my firm featured in an article about financial watchdogs reshaping Wall Street. The second was from Marcus, confirming dinner plans for when I returned to the city. The third was unexpected, an email notification from the federal prison email system. David reaching out for the first time in 6 months. I hesitated before opening it, my finger hovering over the screen. Our last communication had been brief and pragmatic, his acknowledgement of some final divorce paperwork that required his signature. Since then, silence. Finally, curiosity won out. "Eleanor, I saw the announcement about your keynote at the ethics conference. It seems inadequate to say I'm proud of you, given everything, but it's true nonetheless. My time here has been clarifying in ways I never expected. The man I became at Blackridge, ambitious at any cost, willing to compromise principles for status, was someone I once swore I'd never become. Somehow, the transformation happened so gradually I didn't recognize it until everything collapsed. I'm working with the inmate education program now, teaching basic financial literacy. These men have made mistakes as I did, but many are trying to rebuild lives on better foundations. There's a certain symmetry to it that feels right. The winter's trial coverage has been everywhere. Sophia's testimony was particularly revealing about her father's long history of market manipulation. I was just another useful pawn in their operations, though that doesn't excuse my willing participation once I understood what was happening. I don't expect a response to this message. I just wanted you to know that the work you're doing matters, not just in exposing fraud, but in helping create systems where ethical voices aren't silenced. The settlement acknowledgement of your contributions to my career was the minimum you deserved, not the maximum. I see that clearly now. Be well, David I. Set the phone down, processing emotions too complex to immediately name. There was no manipulation in his words, no attempt to elicit sympathy or rekindle connection, just a recognition of reality and perhaps a genuine attempt at amends. My phone rang, pulling me from reflection. It was Gloria Harrington, Blackridge's HR director, who had become another unexpected ally in the aftermath of the scandal. "Eleanor, I hope I'm not interrupting your conference." "Not at all. Just finished my presentation." "Wonderful. I wanted to update you personally. The board approved the whistleblower protection policies we discussed. The anonymous reporting system goes live next month, with direct oversight from Hayes's department." "That's excellent news," I replied, genuinely pleased. This had been one of my key recommendations as a consultant, creating mechanisms for employees to report concerns without fear of retaliation. "They're calling it the Walker Protocol," Gloria added. "Seemed fitting, given your role in exposing the Henderson fraud." After the call ended, I stood at the hotel window, looking out over the IE city lights. So much had changed in a single year. The woman who had once sat devastated on the edge of her bed, destroyed by a text message ending her marriage, felt like a different person entirely. The divorce settlement had indeed left me financially secure. with my share of the offshore accounts providing a comfortable cushion even after legal fees. But the real value had been in the public acknowledgement of my contributions to David's career, which had opened doors I hadn't even known existed. My consulting firm, Walker Financial Integrity, now employed 7 people and had a waiting list of clients seeking expertise in detecting and preventing financial manipulation. I'd testified twice more in the ongoing prosecutions of Blackridge executives, each appearance further establishing my professional credibility, independent of the whistleblower narrative. Most importantly, I'd reclaimed my sense of self, not as David's wife or support system, but as a financial expert with valuable skills and insights. The confidence I now carried into boardrooms and conference halls was built on genuine expertise, not defiance or revenge. A text from Marcus interrupted my reflection. Dinner at 8? Celebrating your keynote and some news of my own. I smiled, typing back a quick confirmation. My relationship with Marcus had evolved gradually from professional allies to something deeper. We were taking it slowly, both aware of the complex circumstances that had brought us together, but the connection felt genuine and grounding. Before heading to dinner, I considered whether to respond to David's email. After a moment's thought, I composed a brief reply. David, thank you for your message. I'm glad to hear you're finding meaning in the education program. The ethics conference was indeed a positive experience, particularly connecting with other professionals working to create more transparent financial systems. I hope you continue to find clarity during this time. Eleanor, not warm, not cold, just honest, the same quality I now insisted on in all areas of my life. As I gathered my things for dinner, I caught my reflection in the hotel mirror. The woman looking back bore little resemblance to the one who had discovered her husband's betrayal a year ago. This Eleanor stood straighter, her eyes clearer, her expression confident in a way that came from within rather than being defined by someone else's perception. He had left me for someone he thought was better, someone with connections and status that would advance his ambitions. In doing so, he'd lost everything: his freedom, his reputation, his wealth, his future in finance. But I had gained something far more valuable than material assets or professional status. I had gained myself, undiminished, unbowed, and finally, seen for exactly who I was. As I stepped into the evening air, I felt not the grim satisfaction of revenge completed, but the quiet confidence of a woman who had faced betrayal and emerged stronger. The story that had begun with a devastating text message had evolved into something unexpected. Not just the downfall of the man who had underestimated me, but the rise of the woman who had finally recognized her own worth. That, in the end, was the most satisfying victory of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.